This is Speak Up. I am Sandra Schulte. Welcome back to our show. Today I'm very pleased to have Barry Latzer, JD and PhD Emeritus Professor of Criminal Justice at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, with us. He is going to talk about the concept of the myth of overpunishment and the defense of the American justice system. He is going to end by giving us a proposal to reduce incarceration while protecting the public.
What this shows is that when people commit crimes and when they're punished for it, we have a big gap between those two phenomena. Let's take the crime that's punished the most. Let's take murder. All right? So that's the first row, murder. It's under crime. And you can see 16,425 people, murders were known to the police in the year 2019, which was before the pandemic, so that's a good year to look at these figures. Of the 16,000 plus, over 9,352 were arrested. And of the 9,352, 8,033 were imprisoned. Now let's go back to the original figure. How many murders were there? Over 16,000, right? 16,425. And how many were imprisoned for murder? A little over 8,000. In other words, half.
Yeah.
Half the murderers were imprisoned. The other half were not. And if you think that's disturbing, go down the list of crimes, and it gets worse for each one. What percentage of the rapists? 22,583 rapists were admitted to prison, but 139,815 rapes were known to the police. They arrested 19,592, and more people were admitted to prison than arrested because some of these cases were from a previous year before 2019, and some involved multiple actors at the same time. So more people were imprisoned for rape than were actually arrested. But nonetheless, 139,815 rapes known to police, only 22,583 admitted to prison. You still think we overpunish? It doesn't look like it, right?
Right.
Because all these crimes take place and only a small percentage of the offenders are put into prison.
Or even make it to court.
They may not even make it to court. I have data on that too, very interesting data. Even if they make it to court, they may not be punished with incarceration. They may be released to what we call probation. In fact, about a fourth of the violent criminals are released to probation instead of put into an incarcerative situation, a jail or a prison.
25%.
Almost. I think it's 22% plus, something like that, if I can recall the numbers. But it's still a shockingly high number. 30% or more of felons, almost a third of felons, convicted felons now, these are people who were convicted, receive probation. They don't go to prison. Now, they may have served a little time in jail, but jail is transitory. Jail is short term, you see. Jail is for people who were arrested and they're awaiting their adjudication. Or if they've been sentenced and they're on their way to prison, they may spend a short time in jail. But prison is where the real punishment takes place, or the not so real punishment for a lot of folks. So some people, Sandra, who are convicted of a crime, a felony, a serious crime, don't get punished with incarceration. They get probation instead. So I think overpunishment is a myth, as I said in my book. I don't think it's true.
How much crime are repeat offenders or, so-called recidivists responsible for?
Tremendous amount.
Done by repeat offenders?
Yes, tremendous amount. In fact, to some extent, Sandra, the same guys, and it's often males, are responsible for a goodly amount of our crime. I'm trying to dredge up in my mind the figures. Almost half of the crime is done by a small group of people. Here's one figure I know to demonstrate recidivism, though. Prior to going to prison, Sarah, most of the inmates who ended up there had on average 11 arrests per person.
Wow.
11 arrests.
Wow.
In other words, police at different points arrested them on average about 11 times. And we saw how many were arrested and not punished, so we shouldn't be shocked. Now listen to this.
Yes.
After they served their time in prison, those who did go to prison, after they served and they were released, the data showed that over a 9-year period, 83% of them were arrested again.
Wow.
8 out of 10
Wow.
were arrested again.
So the prison didn't really
It didn't
make an impression.
It didn't make an impression. It didn't make a good enough impression. So do we have a recidivism problem? We sure do. We sure do. Now people complain, the reformers complain, well, recidivism, they say, is a slippery term. Depends how you define it. If you define it by arrest, you get one number. If you define it by convictions, you get another number. But all that is true. It doesn't matter. We do know that the same group of people repeat their crimes over and over again until the system puts them out of business long term. Those are facts. They're indisputable.
Should we look at chart 3?
Sure. It'll probably prompt me to say something. Well, this is similar to the previous one.
Yes.
Because this shows you how many people are known to the police, how many crimes are known to the police, and how many people are actually punished for it. And you can see the numbers are shockingly low. They really are.
Yes.
Let's take aggravated assault. That's a good one.
All right.
So regular assault would be something like a fight.
Uh-huh.
2 men and they're punching one another. That's regular assault. Aggravated assault means that one person inflicts a serious injury on another person.
He puts out his eye, for instance.
All right. Say with a knife or a gun.
Uh-huh.
So aggravated assault is often, I call it a failed murder. He shot, and he wasn't such a good shot. The guy didn't die, but he's seriously wounded. That's
Yes.
aggravated assault. Or you could say attempted murder, but we won't quibble about the criminal law matter. So, 821,182 aggravated assaults. How many are imprisoned? 55,268.
Or 7% of those who were incidents that were reported. Wow.
Are we over punishing? Oh my gosh. These are almost free rides in some of these cases. That is, they're crimes without punishment.
Now,
I'm sorry, please.
Go ahead.
No, please, go ahead.
African Americans comprise about 38% of American prisoners.
Yes.
That's roughly 3 times their percentage within the general population.
Yes.
Well, how do you explain the blatant racial disparity?
Yes. It is blatant. It's disturbing. But that doesn't mean it's racism.
Yeah.
Racism, of course, would be bias, discrimination, treating a black man differently from a white man for the same misconduct. All the studies show that this type of racism, racial discrimination, is minimal at worst. And almost all the studies show that the reason for the high imprisonment rates of African Americans has to do with misconduct, imprisonable offenses. African Americans have very high violent crime rates. And as we saw in the earlier screen, violent crime is a big driver of imprisonment. Remember, 55.5% of all the prisoners have committed violent crimes. So I think it's fair to say that the high rates of imprisonment of African Americans are attributable more to their high offending rates than to race discrimination.
Bring up chart 4, please.
Okay. So how do I know that African Americans have such high rates of violent crime? This chart is based on data from the CDC. That's the Centers for Disease Control. Police have nothing to do with this data.
Yes.
Okay? And what it shows is the rate, the title of the chart is not here, but I'm going to explain it. It shows the rate of homicide death.
Homicide, you mean death.
Okay. Homicide means death caused by another human being. Now, that could be a crime, murder. It is not necessarily a crime. Some homicides are not criminal. For instance, I'm cleaning my gun, you walk by, and oh my God, the gun misfires, and you're killed. Now that might not be a crime because it's an accident. I didn't intend your death. I didn't even know, let's say, that you were walking by. So that may not be a crime, but it's a homicide. Why? Because a human being caused the death of another human being. So the Centers for Disease Control keep records on this, Sandra. How do they get the records? Whenever someone dies, a doctor fills out a death certificate. The death certificates from an area are sent up to a county office, and the county offices all over the country send that information to the CDC. And they collate and determine what the statistical inferences are, the statistical outcomes are. So if we can get that chart back up now, I'll explain what this shows. For each decade, and then up to 2016, we see the rates of homicide mortality, that's homicide death at the hands of another human being, for each racial group. So let's take 2016, the most recent. In 2016, 5.2 per 100,000 whites died due to homicide. What about blacks? 38 blacks died due to homicide. And if we tabulate the average over across from 1950 on to 2016, we could see that the black homicide victimization, now these are people who died, these are victims. The black homicide victimization rate is 8 times on average the white homicide victimization rate. Yes, you want.
What would you like our audience to take away with them?
So what does this show? This shows that blacks die because of being shot or stabbed or in some way killed by another human being at much higher rates than whites, much higher rates. And now the final point, in almost every case, the black victim is killed by another black person. So that's the crime boom that I alluded to earlier. That's the long-term crime wave. I call the one we went through, Sandra, a crime tsunami, because it was more than a wave. It was just overwhelming, and it went on for, as I said, 2.5 decades. I think the factors associated with the crime boom, which began in the late 60s, were threefold. And we're not seeing those factors now, which is why I don't think we're entering into another boom.
Mm-hmm.
So factor number one, you had a big demographic change. The so-called baby boomers, my generation, the people born right after World War II, late 40s, early 1950s. They turned to the most crime-prone years. They entered the most crime-prone years, starting in the late 60s, early 70s. That's 18 to about 25. So you had a big bulge, a big increase in 18 to 25-year-olds. And of course, if it's males, you're going to get more violence because males do almost all of the violent crime. So that was factor one, the baby boom. By the way, that alone, Sandra, would have caused an increase in crime. If you have a location and you have a sudden increase in young males,
Right.
it's predictable. You're going to get more crime just for that alone. So that was factor one. Factor two, you had the migration to the big cities of the Northeast of an African American population from the South that already had high violent crime rates. We know this because I studied this phenomenon for the earlier periods in the 20th century. So when you had this huge migration, it was a huge migration largely for job opportunities up north, also for greater freedom because the South still had the so-called Jim Crow system of race discrimination. So African Americans came north and flooded into the big cities of the north, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York City, Boston. And unfortunately, they brought a great deal of crime with them. So anyone who lived through this period knows this. We don't want to speak about it, of course, because it sounds like you're being a racist. But those are the realities, those are the facts. That's what happened. And anyone who lived through that period in New York, for instance, they know who was doing a lot of the crime. So that was factor number two. And the third factor in the big crime tsunami was that the criminal justice system became what I call flabby. It became weak. And of course, we're seeing some of that now, which is very dangerous. What do I mean? I mean the police didn't arrest as many people as they had been. When they were arrested, they often were released. When they were convicted, the sentences were lighter. In other words, the system wasn't punishing people the way it had. And this was true in the late 60s and early 70s, perhaps because the system was overwhelmed by crime and they weren't ready for this big crime increase. Those three factors, Sandra, those three together caused the major crime increase. And it lasted for a terribly long time. So those are the three that caused the crime boom. Now, are we seeing those again? Should I continue?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Take it away.
So, are we seeing a migration to these northern cities of groups with high crime rates? No, we're not really. We're not really. There are some Hispanic groups that have high crime rates, but a lot of the immigrants to New York now are not high crime immigrants. for instance, those from Eastern Europe. They don't have very high crime rates.
And from Latin America?
Some are, some not. So it really depends. It
Yeah.
depends. So I don't see the big influx into the city of high crime groups now, currently. All right? What about the demographics? No. In fact, the population's aging. More people with gray hair are entering our population count. There's not a big increase in youth at this point. In fact, the youth population is going down. Factor 3, the weak criminal justice system. Well, that's kind of controversial, right? The system was punishing people. The so-called reform folks said over-punishing people, right? Up till about the 1990s. And in fact, we even passed a major crime bill in the mid-1990s. The Clintons proposed it. Bill was the president. And guess who got it through the Senate? A man you've heard of, Mr. Biden.
Oh.
Senator Biden championed that tough crime bill. Now he says, he regrets it. He certainly didn't say that at the time. He was a big champion of that bill. So, what's happened in the past few years is an unfortunate development. Groups that are persuaded that we have too much incarceration, and my book's written to refute that, of course, are trying to weaken the criminal justice system. They're trying to prevent people from going to prison. They're trying to reduce their sentences. They're trying to keep people out of jail. They're even trying to control the police in a way that reduces their effectiveness. In other words, we now have a sort of self-inflicted wound here with the criminal justice system. We're diminishing its power, we're diminishing its effectiveness on purpose, And this is a red flag to me, because this is that third factor, the flabby criminal justice system, and we're making it flabby ourselves. So we have to resist this. We have to fight back against this. And we're not doing such a good job. In Manhattan, they just elected as a district attorney this Mr. Bragg, who favors reducing the number of people jailed, reducing the number of people in prison, even though this contributes to crime. This, by which I mean his policies. Very dangerous path. And from a prosecutor, wow, that's hard to imagine, isn't it?
How would you look at it from a child psychiatrist's point of view?
Well, I don't have much training in psychology, but I guess I would say you're creating incentives to bad behavior. You're removing the disincentives to good behavior. So what do you expect will happen? You're going to get more bad behavior. I guess that's not exactly what a psychologist would say, but that's as close as I can get anyway.
We often hear about innocent men being exonerated.
Yes.
And after being exonerated, being released after decades behind the bars.
Yes.
How can you say that the United States doesn't over-punish
Yes.
with those statistics?
Yeah. These cases are horrible. And of course, the media plays them up, as they should. I mean, what would be more horrible than being imprisoned for years and not really being guilty of the offense? But you know, Sandra, number one, this is not the typical case. This is not the typical case. And we're going to show some data, I know.
Would you please bring up the first chart?
This is not the typical case. And I'm going to allude to these figures in just 1 second.
All right.
And we really cannot change the whole criminal justice system because we have these terrible miscarriages of justice. That would be very inappropriate. When you have singular and unusual examples of something, you don't want to reorganize that entire system. Of course, you want to compensate the victim of those miscarriages of justice, and I'm all in favor of that. But you don't turn the system on its head as if all the cases or most of the cases were like these unfortunate ones. Now, if we can get that first chart up again, I'll show you what the typical case is.
Typical case.
These are the typical cases.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this shows the offenders, the inmates in state prisons. State prisons, there are federal prisons and state prisons. State prisons are 89% of the prison population. So let's just look at the state prisons. Let's get that up once more. Now you can see, if you look at the column on the left, the type of crime, you can see that violent crimes comprise more than half, 55.5% of all the prisoners are in for violent crimes. Now, could a few of those be miscarriages of justice, innocent people? Sure.
Sure, people make mistakes.
Right. God may not make any, but humans do, and it's sad and it's unfortunate, but we can't turn the system upside down because that happened. Let's go back to that chart again, if we may. Look at the kinds of crimes they've committed, Sandra. Murder, rape, robbery, assault, sexual assault, and other crimes of violence.
55% of the prisoners.
Yeah. Nationwide.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what would you do with such people? We'll get to that later, I guess. Look at the second item, okay? Property offenses.
Thank you so much for coming to our show from New Jersey and also from Florida. This is Sandra Schulte for Speak Up. Until next time, have a wonderful, wonderful rest of the day. Goodbye.